Right. So, Kristin and Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate you zooming in from all over the United States with us. Um, can I get you to start by introducing yourselves and your work?
Sounds great. My name is Kristin Bennett. I'm an assistant professor of technical communication at Sam Houston State University in Texas. I've been there since last August in 2022. I got my PhD in writing, rhetoric, and literacies at Arizona State University in May 2022. So this is my first academic position full time on the tenure track. And I'm originally from New Jersey, so I'm very far from home currently. And my research intersects with areas of technical and professional communication, rhetoric and composition, disability studies and/or disability justice, and then rhetorics health and health of health and medicine, as well as digital rhetoric. So I do very interdisciplinary work.
That sounds funny, but I had like visual rhetoric thrown into mine as well.
Hey, hi, my name's Mark Hanna. I'm an associate professor of English at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. I'm also the director of the Writing, Rhetorics, and Literacies program, the graduate and undergraduate programs. We have an undergraduate BA and also the PhD and master's programs. I'm formally trained as a lawyer. I was practiced tax law before I came back to do my work as a professor and return to graduate school. My research primarily works at the intersection of law, rhetoric, and professional communication. In particular, I mentioned how law shows up in professional workplace context. How do we learn to anticipate what it does, specifically not just respond to law, but how do we co-produce law? How do we work with law as we go? I've done work in medical context, and then with Kristin, we started collaborating with like the intersections of law with disability studies or disability issues. Um, so that's where we are. I've been doing this since 2011. So it's been a while.
So, I started to get the answer to the next question in there, which is how does this article fit into your larger bodies of work? How did you come to work together on this particular piece?
Yeah. So in spring 2019, I believe it was, I took Mark's class in kind of an intro to technical and professional writing, writing for the profession. So this was my introduction to technical communication. So it was really exciting for me. As I was in that class, I was, sitting there reflecting. I was doing a lot of policy analysis, documentation analysis, but I didn't have kind of the terminology for it. So I was doing this work in the realm of rhetoric, but I didn't realize there was a whole field of technical and professional writing that was really kind of in line with what I was doing already. And so this was a really exciting class for me because it was kind of eye opening in terms of my professional trajectory. Like I said, now I'm in technical communication. That's part of my position title. And so during that class, and I guess it was kind of towards the end of that class, Mark approached me about doing a collaboration for a special issue of IEEE Transactions on Professional Communication. They were doing a special issue specifically on accessibility. And so he was interested in looking at this kind of combination between legal ADA discourse and then how it shows up in these workplace contexts in relation to disability access. And so this particular piece then kind of stemmed from that original work that we collaborated on, because one thing we were recognizing in our analysis, specifically of JP Morgan's disability access documents, is that while they were doing pretty good job of meeting legal ADA requirements, they weren't necessarily meeting the needs of the disability community as expressed by especially areas like disability justice. And so we saw them meeting the letter of the law, but not necessarily accounting for that kind of justice aspect of disability. And so this piece really came out of that work kind of as a effect of it. I'll let Mark kind of add anything else if he'd like to.
Sure. Within the class, it's the professional writing theory. I'm working with students who are interested in thinking about how technical communication is implicated in their particular research areas. For a lot of folks, it's not there. They're interested in writing studies, like first year composition. So
Mhm.
I'm always like, okay, how does it's still a feature of your work? How can we think about that? And then there's instances like with Kristin who have an interest in disability. And I'm like, well, this is more, I don't want to say it's at home in technical communication, but it has more direct connections.
Mhm.
And for me, this was the first time a student came in with an interest in disability studies. So it was a lot for me. I was like, I have a burden here to learn more about this because I was really trying to help Kristin, like not transition over. I'm not saying I'm not here to
Recruit.
turn you into a TPP person. That's not like convert you in some way. It was like, how can I support that work? And in what you're doing. So I always like in class conversations, like, hey, what is there some type of disability implication here? And I remember she would tease those out for us as a class. And as she said, the IEEE special issue call came out. We did that, and then right before the pandemic started, JBTC submitted a special issue about ethics, and we're
Mhm.
like, hey, we think this work, as Kristin noted. Writing this paper was a little harder because we did it all through Zoom and distance. But
Yeah.
it just a for me, and this is anticipating, I think, a question you're going to ask later. It's like
Mm.
how, as mentoring, like we did a project, like what's its next step? What's this trajectory of work? And this JBTC piece just fell in really nicely. It gave us a venue for more explicitly getting at the law side of
Mhm.
things.
Would it make more sense to jump down to that end bit and talk about that process bit of trying to work with
Sure,
kids? Um,
sure.
yeah, so, um, as you said, you started doing this just before the pandemic. Everyone was pivoting to Zoom, working remotely. And as I told you all beforehand, my students are just starting this week a remote collaboration module. They're all sending me their screenshots of their Zoom meetings. At the moment, working on team writing and collaborative writing for the first time. Um, what would be your big takeaway from writing this article together under those circumstances? What would you recommend to folks who are engaging in collaborative writing remotely?
Yeah. I think communication is really important in any form of collaboration. So, kind of drawing out not clear distributions of labor, but figuring out what parts each person is going to contribute to. And then having check ins, I think, is really important, especially in a remote capacity. So, you continuously kind of meet up and touch base on how things are going because it's very easy for things to go awry if you're never having those kind of check in points together. I think deadlines are also really helpful. We got lucky because we had two special issue calls for these pieces. And so we had kind of that motivation of meeting those deadlines that were given to us. But if you don't have deadlines, I think creating those deadlines, being accountable to each other. And that's something I think that is wonderful about collaborative writing in a way that writing on your own doesn't always allow for, where you have this other person who is keeping you accountable and saying, okay, what have you done since our last meeting? And it kind of motivates you, I think, to get things done in a way that that individualized process might not. And I think it's also, again, important to be working with people that you trust. So when Mark approached me with the collaboration, I really trusted him as an instructor. Like I had him in class, and I trusted his perspective. I felt like it was going to be a very equitable process, and he kind of explained it all to me from the beginning. So that was really helpful. And what he said to me was exactly kind of how it played out. So I think if you're going to collaborate with folks, having a relationship previously is always helpful. But if you have never worked with them before, maybe talking to others who have to see kind of what that process was like, just so you know, kind of going in with eyes open, what to expect. And obviously, everyone has different experiences collaborating with different individuals, but you can often identify trends. And I know this kind of gets at another question, and I'll save it for later. But especially for graduate students, I think that's really important, kind of talking to other students who have worked with faculty members to see kind of what that process looked like for them. Because I think we all know that that can be very different depending on the faculty member that you're collaborating with. And I'll let Mark has done a lot of collaboration, so I'm going to let him kind of take on this one.
Okay. I think for all like faculty student mentoring relationships, there's always this question about leadership
Mhm.
in terms of who will take direction or who will give direction. And I learned early on that, students really are looking for direction from you. And so I was like, okay, let's do this. But then I did it in a way where it didn't empower them for students. So I was in this context, I was very clear with Kristen. I was like, you're the leader.
Mhm.
I'm going to mentor you to help you learn how to be a first author and what that means, how you make decisions and you actually direct me in many respects. So it's like this empowerment idea. And to do that, though, I had to be confident that Kristen could do it, that she had the capacity and she would be, not that not everyone can be leaders, but I just through my engagements with her in class and through office hours, I could tell that she had this latent leadership ability. And I was like, well, that we're going to practice it. You're going to develop it. So I really had to, that mentoring relationship, it was there at first. Like my job was to help you think about what does it mean to think about an article? What does it mean to think about publishing in a venue? What does it mean to think about the types of claims you want to make, the literature you want to cite? So we had a lot of conversations, and then Kristin would take that in and then go off, write some, and then come back with a plan. And I'd say, okay. And I was always mindful, like, you need to push back when I'm saying something. I was like, you tell me. And I felt weird. I was like telling her to tell me I'm wrong, but I didn't, that wasn't the impression I wanted wrong. But it was just this, I want to take direction from you. And then from the first project to the second project, it eased up a little bit. I was less of like, hey, directing her to be a leader. And then in our most recent operations, like something we're working on now, like it's just natural. We're our natural colleagues.
Mhm.
That student-teacher relationship has fallen away, which is
Yeah.
nice.
Can I add one thing? Sorry. Because I don't know if we're going to go back to this, but I think it's a really great opportunity for graduate students to work with faculty because the publication process can be really overwhelming and um, hard to navigate in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of kind of insider information that you won't necessarily have if you've never done that work before. And I felt like working with Mark really helped me to navigate that process and learn how to not be so afraid of it, and to really recognize when you get things like feedback from reviewers, it's really an opportunity to help your work grow and develop, and to not be afraid of that peer review process. I actually love it now. When I get feedback, I'm actually excited to read it because it helps me to improve. And I think my writing has gotten so much better just from participating in that peer review process. And also working with Mark helped me in recognizing that there are things you can do to work within that process. So, for example, I think we've all had feedback before where we've had two reviewers, for example, that had conflicting views on our work, sometimes about the same exact areas of the work. And so, one thing that I learned with working with Mark is that you can talk to the editors and kind of get clarification about which direction to maybe go in, because I never would have thought that I could contact them. Also, there are times, especially during the pandemic, where you need a little extra time on revisions or on the first draft, and so knowing that you can reach out and often they will grant you additional time, I think that's something I never would have thought that I could do. So it's just working with someone, you learn a lot of the ins and outs of the process that as a beginner you would have to learn over time. And so I think you kind of fast forward through a lot of that and you get insight pretty quickly in a way that might have taken years, for example. So I just wanted to add that because I do think it's such a great opportunity for grad students to work with faculty.
Yeah, you get to learn it without making the traffic helicopters going over my house. Yeah, you get to learn how to do this without having to make the mistakes for yourself. I think is really
Yeah.
nice about it. And for these students, they're often in their masters. They're currently working on their dissertations, working directly with supervisors for the first time. Some of them may go on to research and PhD programs, and for others, they'll be heading off into industry. So I think it's so helpful to hear that mindset part as something that they can apply in all these different contexts.
Yeah.
All right, so let me hit you with the really big question that I felt a little bit bad about putting right at the start, but it seemed like the right place to put it. One of the things that I love about technical communication is that it is practical. It's something that you can kind of apply in context, and it does stuff sometimes quite fast, sometimes quite slow. This is the second year that I've assigned this piece, and every year I get this question about local and individual action against institutional workplace constraints, the need for structural change. And as you say in that piece, right, change is hard, and these are big topics. So the really big question is disability justice possible without structural change in the systems that we have? And maybe the easier question, maybe the route into it, is thinking about implementing the guidelines that you present in this piece. How do individuals implementing those guidelines contribute to that larger project of social change and disability justice?
So kind of broadly, I think I'm going to move out a little bit first, but this is something that I grapple with a lot. And I did a certificate in gender studies. And so this is something that came up in every class that I had. about, you know, can we work within a system or do we need to dismantle it in order to really invoke this change that we're calling for? And so one thing I continuously go back to is Walton Moore Jones's work, where they talk about the need for us to continuously reflect on our own practices, not only the practices of our institutions, but how we engage and participate in those different institutions, whether they be our workplace, whether they be educational institutions, or different types of organizational structures. And so I think it's really important to kind of hone in on your own kind of engagements and think of on the local. I liked that you had kind of the local level versus this kind of structural level, because I do think that change can start at the local level and influence those larger structures. I do also think that you can dismantle the whole thing and kind of start from there, but it is very overwhelming to even entertain that, kind of just abstractly. But if we're in the system, I think we definitely can invoke change and kind of move outward, specifically by interrogating our own actions and how we're contributing to maybe these problematic systems in ways that we didn't anticipate. And so the best example I have of this kind of practically is if you're a teacher like I am, so I teach for the university, is really engaging in kind of reflective practices of teacher research, really thinking about what we're doing and the impacts that it's having on a range of students in our classroom spaces. Because I think all of us can attest to the fact, if we've ever taught a class, right, that sometimes we anticipate certain ways of engaging in the classroom that don't play out in the ways that we're expecting them to, especially in online classes. And so it's important, I think, to figure out why things are happening and how things are how different student body minds are engaging with our, for example, in the educational area with our curriculum. And so I think teacher research can be helpful, and practices like that are very reflective in nature, because they might make us think critically about what we may have come to accept as kind of normal or neutral practices, like things like policies, thinking about why we have those policies and how those policies may impact a range of student body minds in ways we didn't expect. And so I think that teacher research can be helpful, especially if we're engaging with a range of students, to see how these different practices are, again, playing out for them. So I think if you're going to do that kind of work, it's really important to take an intersectional scope and an intersectional approach to it, so that you're really thinking about, okay, there are all these different student body minds in my classes. How are they all experiencing this activity similarly and then differently, right? What's coming up for them? And so whenever possible, having participants kind of engage with you and having collaborations, I think, with students can be really helpful as well. Also, in terms of kind of the local influencing the global, community partnerships, I think, are really important, especially for those of us who work for universities, because the university has a huge impact on the local community. And so I think when we can collaborate with different stakeholders in that local community, we can again kind of see how the practices we're engaging with may be playing out in ways that we didn't anticipate, and also use our knowledge that we take from our specific areas of research and put it into practice and see how it again plays out in reality for these different stakeholders. So I am definitely a believer that I think change can happen from within. I think it can be very overwhelming either way, right? We can feel stifled by larger institutional spaces that may have these structural issues, as a part of what they are, right? But I think we can definitely make change happen through our individual localized efforts.
I'm gonna just do a layer above this, I think, in terms of like everything. I'm in agreement with what Kristen was laying out. If we think about the guidelines that are in the chat in the article itself, a lot of my research is I work in interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary contexts, and I'm always like, okay, how do we develop shared language? Because shared language is a starting point from which we can do the work that we need to. So we can think about that locally or globally. At the local level, here's how we talk about the stuff. Here's the concepts we have. What are our starting points? And then we can start to look out, well, in the larger discourse community, does that conflict with what we're doing?
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about operating at the local level to like this idea of disability justice, for it to it depends on coalitions. It depends on collaboration in many respects. So at the heart of that, though, is like, well, how do we develop shared language around like ideas like what does it mean to reframe access as a collective endeavor? Like what are our commitments with that language? What are we recognizing as the work that's implicated in that? and just developing. I don't want to say we all need to agree, but what's our baseline understanding from which we can work um, through these different concepts or ideas and think about how to apply it. Because again, the application is where we're interested. I'll just conclude, like in law, this, how do we make things intelligible? Like the law only sees certain things as intelligible. The everyday has to be translated into some type of, I don't want to say code, but something that's recognized by the courts. That same concept of intelligibility applies here. Like,
Mhm.
how do we make these disability justice principles intelligible amongst ourselves, but also to the public, the advocacy that we want to engage in?
Mhm. And thinking about disability justice too, I think in those collaborations, it's so important to be collaborating with those who are most impacted by potentially oppressive structural um, norms. Specifically, thinking again about race, gender, disability, sexual identity, all of those aspects of your identity. I think it's important that we have a range of stakeholders involved in those collaborations, because you can't really understand the extent of that structural the extent of those structural implications if you aren't working with those who are most impacted by them. So I think that's really vital when you're creating those partnerships, to make sure that you are collaborating with a range of individuals.
Mhm. Well, this takes us quite nicely to the next question we have here. So, people with disabilities and disabled people are among the most affected, obviously, by ableism in workplaces and other contexts. Um, might or might not be the most motivated to produce change, but might also not really be in a position to lead change or to really drive change. Um, what would your advice be for disabled technical and professional communicators who want to transform their workplaces?
So I think again, it goes back to this idea of building a coalition. I think that's really important, and working with a range of individuals, because again, in the disability community, while we believe that change should be motivated by the experiences of disabled individuals, we recognize that it's not just on them to create this change. So especially when you think about the principles of disability justice, access is always collective. It requires communal change and communal efforts. So if you're not engaging in coalition, you're not doing disability justice, right? And I think disability is also really important because it recognizes that as individuals we are dynamic, right? So there may be certain times of our lives where we want to be more active and we want to engage more in more seemingly active ways, and there may be other times in our lives where we need other people to kind of take the lead, right? And so I think having that coalitional framework is really important, and also recognizing that everybody brings something to the table in those coalitional relationships. All of us have a knowledge that is very much situated to our own experiences, right? And what we've the different institutions that we've engaged with, the different organizations that we're a part of. And so if we only are focused on our own perspective, we're never going to be able to create change because it's so complicated. Because again, as disability justice advocates, we need to recognize the connection between ableism, racism, sexism. And if we're not engaging with populations and individuals that represent all of those complicated realities, we can't invoke those changes. And just like for my collaborations with Mark, again, it's been really insightful because we both bring different kind of perspectives to this work. And his legal perspective is very different than my kind of disability studies, disability justice, again, technical communication perspective. And so we wouldn't be able to do the work that we've done if we didn't have these differences. And if you're taking an intersectional approach, you recognize that difference is something that we should welcome. It's something that is generative. It's vital to change, right? And so in building those coalitions, I think that attention to difference, that centering of difference, whether we're engaging with disability justice specifically or other forms of social justice, I think are really integral to that work.
Working off the idea that coalition is at the heart of this, how do we develop meaningful relationships? I know that's like, it's not as obvious as what we think. It's like, yeah, sure, we need meaningful relationships. It's like, what are practices for that, and identifying what those might be or what's the potential for them in some way. So it's I think someone in the position that you described, it's like, who do I want to align with? Who do I not align? Who do I want to like build coalition with in some way? And it's Kristen used the table. We all bring different things to the table. How can we be explicit about what is brought to the table? And that
Mm.
like having folks say, not that this is my only expertise, but this is where my strength is. This is where where my capacities are most heightened. And this is where I have some expertise, but where I might need some, not help, but I need some complementary work or complementary expertise that can fuse together to bring about the kind of change that we want to see. Um, there's a challenge though, like that can be too instrumental. It's like you go through it like a la carte, like, okay, this person's good at this person's good at this, and it has to be more than that. And these conversations aren't easy, I know, and especially from like a marginalized position or a position of reduced power or limited power. It's like, how do you have these conversations? I think just being upfront in some ways, like making that part of your ethos, looking for that, for collaborators who carry that same type of ethos, as just a principle, like this practice of building coalition and being intentional about it.
All right, my next question I'm going to read exactly verbatim. The student that wrote this was very, very specific, and I cannot remember all of it. So we had a student who picked up on a line pretty early in the piece, and asked if you could expand on it. This is like a line kind of in the lit review. So on page 331, the authors note universal design's potential to exclude and erase disabled experiences by normalizing them. So how might designs, universal design or otherwise, which bring a greater diversity of experiences and body minds into the normate, be incompatible with principles of disability justice?
Yeah, I thought this was a really good question, because it's something that I think a lot of people in the field grapple with. But from my understanding of disability justice in relation to universal design, I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive. I think they can actually work really well together, but it depends on how you're using those tools. So when I've been engaging with universal design, something that's been really important for me is recognizing what Margaret Price and Dolmage talk about, in the sense that we have to understand universal design as recursive and ongoing, and it's never complete. So in theory, universal design should not create a normate, because it should never be satisfied with itself, right? We should always be continuously questioning what is normative according to our design and discursive engagements. And so if we're taking it as this dynamic, ever-changing phenomenon, I think it can very much fit in with disability justice, which very much sees access as this frictional, ongoing phenomenon that, again, we need all these individuals involved with, and that is never done. And it can be really exhausting, right? Recognizing that work is never done, that we're never going to fully achieve that idea of universal design, because it's something that we need to always be working towards. And so as an instructor, right, that's something that overwhelms me sometimes, right? That's why I think, again, when we think about reflective practices like teacher research, or reflecting on our own professional engagements in whatever organization we're a part of, it's so important to really think through those complexities of who am I anticipating in the work that I'm doing, and whom I might be leaving out. And often, sometimes when we give access to some individuals, we may be denying access to others, especially when we think about things like multimodal engagements in class, right? Multimodal projects like infographics, podcasts, they're great because they allow a range of individuals to draw from their embodied experiences. But we have to make sure that when we use these multimodal tools, we're not then creating access issues for other students, right? And so it's really important when we're kind of engaging with any form of universal design that we're continuously reflecting on, okay, how is this working? Maybe surveying our students and seeing how they're actually engaging with the projects, and working with them to make it work for all of those different individuals. So as an instructor, I personally always see my classes as kind of open to ongoing revision. I do surveys throughout the semester to see how things are going for students. And often I recognize that what may have worked previously is not working for this particular group, or maybe even this one student. And it's important that we be accountable to that and change accordingly. So I think if we're continuously kind of challenging this idea of normal, then it really can help us to take universal design and make it something that is used towards disability justice. One thing that I would kind of give as an example for myself as a scholar is that as I've been engaging more and more with disability justice, my work has become kind of increasingly intersectional. And in the field of disability studies, for those of you who are familiar, I'm sure you've heard these terms before, kind of the medical model of disability and the social model. And they're for a long time were kind of these two mutually exclusive camps of thought, right? That we have to reject medical intervention and recognize disability as this social phenomenon. But as we engage with more and more intersectional work, especially as I engage more and more with that, I become more critical of that division because I recognize that body minds like people of color have been historically denied access to medical care, been historically denied access to things like diagnosis. And that has huge implications, right, for the need for medical intervention and medical access. So I don't think for things like that, it's not an either or, it's kind of a both and. And I would say the same thing for universal design and disability justice. If we're applying intersectionality to our engagement with this, universal design, I definitely think it can be a tool for disability justice. It just depends on who's using the tools and how they're being used. So that's just kind of a broad overview, but I think kind of thinking about that, it's problematic when we see universal design kind of as this closed system that isn't finished because it never is, right? We have to recognize that it, just like all of us, it's this dynamic phenomenon that we need to continuously go back to and revisit in order to use it for its best purposes or best intentions within either academic or professional realms.
Working off Kristen's comment about like continual change or a closed system, it's like law is presumed to be a closed system, like a decision is made and then it moves forward, and lay folks can't participate in it or we can't impact that system in some way. So thinking about universal design in law, it's like law too is recursive. And there's an uncertainty to law that how do we account for this in some way? Um, that the ADA, this concern with like compliance is like, well, it's something that I can see. If I do A and B, I know I'm going to be fine. Well, that's like there's a certainty involved in that, or there's so how do you welcome law's uncertainty, or how do you actually engage with it in some way? Like right now, there's a new Supreme Court case that's going to be I think argued in a couple months, this idea of this tester case. Like before, you could send a tester into an environment to see if it met accessibility conditions or if it's complying with the ADA in some way. And this tester requirement may no longer be allowed, that you can't have testers. And so like whatever that decision may be, it's like, well, how do you think about that, anticipate what that might be, like your continual reflection, it's you're thinking ahead, trying to account for how that might show up if that were to be the case, so that you're not designing after the fact. If that case then disappears, or that law leads to such a thing where the tester disappears, then how do we build that system in? So my encouragement is to, well, let's get out ahead of it. How can't maybe we can't get out ahead of it, but how can we attempt to? What types of thinking might we need to engage in? So it's in the same way, recursivity, law is not closed, but justice depends on dealing with law's uncertainty and trying to not just navigate it, but leverage it too in positive ways, to create the conditions you would like to see for justice to be realized.
Right. So we have coming up on time. So, Kristin, you said that you two are working on something else together at the moment. What do you all have on the boil, together or individually? What can we look forward to seeing from you? Give your work a plug.
I'll let Mark talk about kind of our big our larger upcoming collaborative project, but I just had an article come out in Technical Communication. My work is kind of not veering in a new direction, but I guess engaging with a new field. So I'm engaging more and more with rhetorics of health and medicine. And so the article that just came out looks at advertisements for medical insurance specific positions, and thinking about job advertisements and how we need to think more critically about the language that's incorporated in those advertisements, especially in the medical field, thinking about disability justice and trying to make them as inclusive as possible. And I've also been engaging with comics, which is pretty fun. Had a piece come out in image text, thinking about how we can use different types of graphic medicine for the purposes of disability inclusion, especially when we think about the complexities of visual access to those images. And so that, I think that was a really fun piece for me to write. So I see myself kind of engaging more and more with that field of rhetorics and of health and medicine. But I'm not saying goodbye to technical communication by any means. I see the two as very intertwined, especially when we're thinking about disability.
I was laughing at the comics because my Tuesday night Ask the Author meeting was with Larry Abbott and his piece from that special issue of TCQ about comics in technical
Yeah,
communication. So which was a big hit.
that's
Everyone was
great.
excited about that. So they'll be excited to hear that you're doing it as well.
Yeah, it's a cool field. It's
Yeah.
really exciting. It's up and coming. I think it's developing more and
Mhm.
more. The RHM symposium, I know they've had some workshops on
Mhm.
or graphic medicine. They had a bunch of them last year. I don't know if they're going to do that again, but
I think there
yeah,
is one this year. I can't make it over there for it, but I think there was one on the schedule.
yeah. It seems to be a field that people are getting more and more excited about. So
Mm.
I'm working on two projects. They're of a piece, I think. One's a collaborative with Kristin, the other's it's a solo authored monograph project I'm working on. This idea that law has a grammar, not a linguistic grammar, but in terms of more, there's an underlying grammar that induces law in certain ways. Well, how can we, if we have to understand law, understand how law shows up, we need to understand how it's induced. And like I'm arguing that there's like simultaneity, relationality, temporality, predictivity, and there's a hierarchy. And so the chapters of that book talk about that grammar. In related strain, like as we think about disability justice and like how do we, all the arguments that we're making, like we need to look beyond the ADA. Well, what does that look like in practice? Like what does it mean to get out ahead of the ADA or to try to do these work that I'm arguing for in the other monograph project? So Kristin and I were thinking through like what might be a good example that we could use as a way to think through this idea of what it means to think beyond the ADA in terms of practice for scholars. What might that mean? What might it look like? We've just like been kicking ideas around. So I guess the first step for us would be like, how do we put a proposal together for a project like that? So we're both excited about it. It's a little daunting. I think it's our
yeah,
taking our collaborative writing in to a new realm,
Mhm.
like more of a larger scope. So
Mhm. Yeah, I would be excited to see that as well. I'm just thinking about applying this more readily in contexts where like we don't have an ADA equivalent down here, and so getting out ahead of and working outside of those kinds of structures is something that I think
I
would have
really appreciate that comment.
wider
I'm sorry.
impact.
I'm sorry.
No, that's good.
I really appreciate like because I think the impact of our work, it's not just a U.S. like it's a
yeah.
domestic issue like this. I like you're saying, Beck. It's how do you this applies globally. Um, this mindset, habit of mind, whatever you want to call it. So
Yeah, yeah. I
I
look forward.
apologize for interrupting you.
No, not at all. Yeah, I think it's good to riff on things, and yeah, it really does sound like wonderful work. I'm excited to see it in the future.
Sure.
So yeah, um, that's it from me. I want to thank you both so much for taking the time today to yeah, to join us to tell us more about your work, to help us understand it better, and to point us in some new directions. It's been such a pleasure talking to you as well.
Thank you
It's
so
been great
much.
to
And
speak with you too.
if anyone has further questions, they're welcome to reach out to us via email. We can give those emails to you back if you would like them, and people are welcome to follow up on any questions they have.
Awesome. I'll pass that on.